ready? Okay. All right, well, so my name is Deb Davidson. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, which is based in Bozeman, Montana. We work nationally and across the globe on connectivity conservation, so happy to have you all here today. Again, you have to bear with us. This has been a bit of a lift to, this is the only presentation that actually has someone virtually presenting. So thanks for your patience. I'm sorry it was a little slow. So this morning, Lucy Wagaring from the African Conservation Center will be joining us. Phil Huffman from Quebec Labrador Foundation and Katri Montecone from the Quebec Ecological Corridors Initiative. And we're going to unpack connectivity conservation. And we're going to talk about how connectivity conservation is really key for climate resilience. This is really complex work. I know a lot of you are involved in connectivity conservation. I know Doug has been working on it forever in Australia. And I like to call this work that we do the messy middle. It's really some of the hardest lands to work in. These are lands in between protected areas where often people live, work, agriculture exists, and transportation exists, linear infrastructure. The lands that we work in particular, and we focus on, are fragmented and ecological processes are often disrupted. So today we're going to talk about how do we ensure wildlife and biodiversity can actually find a place to move from one protected area to another? How do ecological processes proceed when landscapes are cut up into tiny postage stamps, which is the case in many of our landscapes? And how do we ensure connections are maintained and in some cases actually restored? So over the next 90 minutes, we want to unpack this and hopefully have some conversation and really give you some inspiration, particularly from the three folks who are going to present, who can give you a sense of what's happening in their landscapes. So I'm going to jump in and just highlight what ecological connectivity actually is. This was defined and ratified at the Convention on Migratory Species this spring, and it's ecological connectivity is the unimpeded movement of species, connection of habitats without hindrance, and the flow of natural processes. And that's really key, when we talk about climate resilience. Ecological connectivity is also not just terrestrial. I think we often think of it as being wildlife migration areas, habitat connectivity areas, so terrestrial lands. But actually it includes freshwater, which is really crucial, and coastal and marine. And all of these are interrelated, as you all know. And when we think of ecological connectivity, I often describe it as the circulatory system for nature, because it truly is the connections that allow ecological processes to proceed. Climate resilience and the connection to ecological connectivity. It's super evident that maintaining, enhancing, and restoring connectivity is a vital nature-based solution to climate change. And this has been supported by the IPCC's sixth assessment that stated that increasing connectivity is the single most consistent cited climate change adaptation for wildlife species and biodiversity. It's also widely documented that movement is essential for wildlife survival. And again, I know a lot of you know this, so some of it is probably a repeat, but dispersal is critical for species to shift their ranges in response to current and future rapid environmental shifts, which include climate change, but also land use. A picture like on the left where we see a landscape completely change from a natural environment to an industrial landscape. The picture or the animation on the right is of projected mammal, bird, and amphibian population movements due to climate change in South America, and you can see they're generally moving west, and this highlights the need for connecting current to future ranges. And this is using a species distribution model to predict locations of future habitat. So one of the things my organization in particular works on is ensuring that connectivity has been adopted by global agreements. And this has really actually happened mainly over the past 10 years. So connectivity is now considered a pretty major keystone to these agreements. It's gained prominence and recognition as a key conservation approach through international policy. And many of these have been actually motivated by the work of the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the ecological connectivity guidelines that we are part of that we established in 2020. And that's really driven a lot of these agreements. In particular, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework commits parties to bolster connectivity in 5 of its targets, which when we achieved that in 2022, my team and others, it was a huge win to actually get it embedded in not just target 3, which is really our 30 by 30 goal, but also 4 other targets. And it really reinforces the opportunities to plan and implement large-scale approaches and apply ecological connectivity across all of our conservation practices. The photo on the left, or the globe, excuse me, that demonstrates that if we were to meet our 30 by 30 goals tomorrow without having those areas connected to other areas, that's what it would look like. It would look very isolated. So really the target that was adopted and targets that were adopted as part of the GBF are not just protected, but connected landscapes. So 30 by 30, connected and protected. And that is really a transformative change in the way we think about conservation. So mandates are one thing, and it's exciting we have the Global Biodiversity Framework, and a lot of people I think are saying, well, what now? So how do we move into action? And one key way is often to identify where connectivity areas are located. That's actually one of the roles that my organization plays, and others like Hadley's, is to identify where priority connectivity places are. And Phil and Katri will talk more about that too, as well as Lucy. These are just 3 examples of how we've been supporting countries in doing that. The one on the left, the regional transboundary, was recently completed in the Pacha region of South America, and it's a modeling specifically for jaguars. So it shows us the high priority connectivity areas for jaguars. The middle was a effort completed, I think it was 2021 in Tanzania, and it's a countrywide assessment that's now really driving action. And that was completed by one of my staff members. And then subnational is really demonstrating connectivity and least cost path, we'll call it, among national forests in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the United States. So another needed component to really take these mandates to the ground is through knowledge transfer and network development. And one of those key areas that I hope you all will consider joining after this is the IUCN World Commission for Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. And that is a group of 1,200 of us across the globe working together to increase the practice of connectivity conservation and also to really support countries as they take on these mandates that are in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Gary Tabor, who is our CEO, and Jody Hilty, who is the CEO of Y2Y, or Yellowstone to Yukon, are the co-chairs, and we serve as the secretariat. Couple more slides on my part. One of the other way that, and this will kind of be interspersed through the other conversations, is that we're seeking to scale up connectivity, obviously, and part of that is by sharing best practices, as the other 3 speakers will, but also we have created a services platform specifically targeted to connectivity conservation, and so countries and partners can come to us and we can provide that kind of ecological assessments, connectivity assessments that there are needed. And finally, with our partners at WWF, CMS, and IUCN, and UNDP, we just completed this connectivity curriculum. It is free. It is I think it's a 6-week session. It is do it on your own pace. But if we actually want to address connectivity conservation across the globe, we have to scale it up in terms of knowledge transfer too, and make it accessible to people in every corner of the globe. This is an approach, an attempt to do that. So please check it out. It just launched. It's pretty exciting. And yeah, I'd love to see you all do it. So now I'm gonna actually shift to Lucy, and this is the tricky part. We'll make sure we actually can figure this out. Is she ready to jump in? Oh, there she is. Hi. Hi, Lucy. So your slides are not showing. Do you want to share your slides on your side, or oh, nope, never mind. Hold that. Lucy, do you want to just take 30 seconds and introduce yourself, and then we're going to switch to your slides, and then we'll hear your voice.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb, and good morning, everyone there in Quebec. Really sorry I couldn't join you. Visa hitches, which are out of our control, but I'm so glad to be able to join virtually. Lucy Waroinge is my name. I'm Conservation Center, a Kenyan NGO that's been working on savanna ecosystems around East Africa for about 30 years. And also more recently got appointed to be the chair of Kenya's Wildlife Conservation Trust Fund, really as a vehicle and mechanism to promote and enable sustainable financing for conservation. And very happy to be present and to listen to all the discussions in this session. Thank you, Deb.
Okay, great, Lucy. We'll switch to your slides, and then we should be able to hear her fine. So, all right.
Okay, so Deb, I think, will you help me transition as I go along?
I sure will. I'll switch it whenever you want.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would like to give maybe about 10 minutes of giving you the context of where we are at with ecological connectivity in Kenya. And as Deb says, the challenges around connectivity continue to grow as populations grow, as land use changes, as government policies sometimes don't change as fast as the reality on the ground. And so Kenya is really at an interesting point of trying to bring to fore the conservation knowledge around connectivity and trying to connect that both with planning and policy at a national level, really scaling up some of the initiatives. Next. So just for context, Kenya sits right at the equator. Very rich heritage by virtue of the fact that we benefit from a variety of species that fit within different altitudinal gradients, over 6,500 plant species, hundreds of which are endemic to our country, and over 1,000 bird species, over 100. And when you look at the large herbivore distribution in Africa, that very niche there of the Great Rift Valley, the Albertine Rift, coming from the Western Uganda, Kenya, and into Tanzania, really describes where you find a great variety of species that exist in that gradient. So with that in mind, for Kenya, if we can go to the next slide, we recognize that looking at getting a clear understanding of the rates of change, both of the biodiversity and the ecosystems within which it exists, is critical. And in 2018, we were involved in coordinating an effort to develop a National Wildlife Strategy Blueprint 2030 for Kenya. And in there, we really brought up to date our knowledge of what do we have. And the picture is pretty much what we're reading in the IPBES reports. Decline and further decline and further decline, losing over 60% of our wildlife between 1977 and 2016, over 90% of the snow cap on Mount Kenya, 40% loss of wetlands, 5% of green spaces in urban areas like Nairobi, over 7.4% forest cover loss, 9% decline of pollinators, and we know how critical that is for food security, and 74% of loss of coral reefs. And we really like amplifying the messaging that came from the IPBES report, that if we continue spaces that hold endemic and very important biodiversity. But we need to not only have increased conservation efforts, such as what we are doing here in looking at connectivity, because fragmented spaces will not secure the required ecological connectivity, but also looking at more transformative in how we produce, in how we consume, in how we manage places in an integrated manner. Next. So this is just a graphic tabular description, and the red cells, without going into too much detail, describe on your top level, you have the different species of mammals. On your left, you have the different counties. Kenya has 47 counties, about 20 of which have some form of important wildlife. And the red cells indicate the points of decline of each of those species across each of the counties. And the main areas of increase, other than buffalo and elephant, we indeed have a success story around elephant because of the effort that's gone in post the poaching era. The greatest increase you find is sheep and goats, cattle, camel, and donkey on your far right. And this is the landscape, if you know much about the East African savannas, is really populated by pastoral communities whose livelihood and lifestyle occupation is pastoralism. And so finding a balance between conservation and pastoralism is key, because wildlife also thrives in the areas where pastoralism is well managed. You remove people and livestock from these pastoral areas, and our wildlife actually struggles, because the sheep and the goats also help opening up some of the bushlands in which you get your but the balance of that means that conservation must make sense, not only for wildlife, but also for the pastoral communities. Next. So here are some examples of what's happened over time due to fragmentation and loss of connectivity. Our famous Nairobi National Park, which is the only park in the middle city, which was the first park also in Kenya in 1946, has lost most of its wildlife to development. So if you look at that picture there with Nairobi National Park in the middle, all the red area is what's been developed and projected to be developed by 2040. So these were modeling projections of land use. 2040, we also expect the hashed brown areas to be fully fenced as people occupy smaller and smaller land parcels. And we then are left with what's currently fenced. But when you look at the projection, we have very little open space left. And currently there's an initiative as high up as the office of the president to rethink how to restore connectivity in this area. It's a hard sell, but the government has made a commitment that if we lose that connectivity, Nairobi National Park becomes a zoo. So it's been very gratifying to see the head of state take this seriously. We are hoping, and I've had discussions with Center for Large-Scale Conservation on looking at wildlife overpasses and how we can do that along this area. The communities on the ground are very keen to participate in establishing conservancies that would see them benefit from conservation. So the opportunity in terms of the interest is there, but how to do the right things in time against the speed against which development is happening is the challenge. Next. So if you can whip through the next park. The next slide is 2023 on that south side of the park. You can look at the density of development. And this was an area that before was filled with sheep and goats and eland. So you have 2003, 2023, and 2013. Just to give you a sense of what happens when there isn't intentional action important for wildlife. Next. So this is another example in the Masai Mara, again, a famous area, I think at one point noted as the 8th wonder of the world. And the big threat there is fencing. As the group ranches have transitioned into subdividing land, people owning smaller parcels choose to fence them. And what you see on your left side is the Mara Reserve, and the black sketches are the fences that have grown over time. If you look on your right, it's a chronological evidence of the density of fences. In 2011, only 444 square kilometers of fence. And in 2020, we're looking at 2,124 square kilometers of fencing. And right now in the Mara, there are initiatives in some of the conservancies, like one called Pardamat, where they are incentivizing communities to defense, to remove their fences, because communities are finding that when they have fenced, their livestock does worse. So it's actually in their interest to have open rangelands that allow mobility both of wildlife and livestock, even for their own livestock. But now you're having to create new incentives to get people to remove the fences that were put a couple of years back. Next. So when we look at Kenya, there's been a lot of work done, and that's the benefit we have in terms of data and expertise. In 2014, ACC coordinated the development of Kenya's capital across all taxonomic groups and the threats and what recommendations are required thereafter. A year later, we were part of the team that defined the wildlife migratory corridors and dispersal areas. And 10 years later, because this report was not implemented, we find we have more corridors that are under threat than were then. And so the current initiative is to really update, not just update a map, because we keep saying in jest that at this rate we'll be mapping, that we now must not only define where the corridors ought to be, but now work with planners and policymakers at the national level to ensure we get the right action that secures those corridors. And the National Wildlife Strategy, and also an atlas done by ILRI on nature's benefits in Kenya, all are the data and knowledge products that we are able to bring into the work that I'll describe to you that we're involved in right now. Next. So the ongoing initiative is that we took the matters of connectivity and loss of critical wildlife areas to the head of state in May, June of last year. And we pointed out that if we continue as business as usual, this great jewel of the wildlife that Kenya is renowned for will actually not be viable. And not only that, so will the livelihoods of pastoralists in those areas. So we got a presidential directive that really was very well received, that one, put a moratorium against development in critical wildlife areas and migratory corridors. Two, mandated that the team and others be brought on board to ensure we update the status of Kenya's wildlife and Kenya's connectivity areas, and then define what are those core conservation areas that we must not lose. We tend to call it the minimum viable conservation of ambition, but really being able to say, can we clearly be clear on our conservation core, which if we lost, everything will go bust. And in that conservation core, what are the principles and instruments we would like applied to land use and land planning? And third, is required for connectivity between those ecosystems and within those ecosystems. Because as happens in most countries during colonial setup of the parks and reserves, ecology and science is not what defined the boundaries of those parks and reserves. And so we're now using ecological processes and the best science to delineate and define our ecosystems in a very clear manner, and then define the connectivity within and between them, because then working with the Land Commission, we can designate the conservation areas in those ecosystems as critical and provide caveats on the land title and eventually easements that enable us to secure this land in perpetuity. So what you see as the black arrows, sorry, the map is fairly crowded, are the identified connectivity corridors and areas for migration. But in the hashed green are the conservancies that have emerged over time. Conservancies in Kenya are voluntary conservation efforts by landowners who declare they would like their land set aside for conservation. And we have now got our law to recognize conservancies as a land use. Now, what we are pushing is to recognize conservation as an action and land use prioritized in these areas. So we have then done a mesh of where are our parks, where are our conservancies in the green, and the hashed areas, sorry, the ones with the squares, are where our wildlife moving to. Because then our connectivity must ensure that those places are well defined. And we are also collaborating with Northern Tanzania, especially through some work that WWF is pioneering on, called SOCONOT, the Southern Kenya Northern Tanzania Initiative, trying to ensure that the connectivity across borders is also aligned and recognized. One area being conservation, and you cross the border and you have cultivation. So this work is fairly advanced, and the presidential directive then gave us the ability to work across other sectors, the agencies that develop roads and rails and highways and power lines and mining, which have been identified as the greatest threats. and figure out how they would implement what they need to with conservation consciousness in the planning. And finally, we are also looking at instruments of buying back or leasing land that was ideally conservation land, but which has transitioned to other individual use. And the model is to buy back the land or lease it and give it back to community under land holding arrangement. So it's not NGOs holding the land. We will facilitate the land buyback, but we will enable communities to have land trusts that then ensure the land is kept for conservation in perpetuity. Next. And so the final example, which is where the pilot work is happening, this is not an easy map to understand, but I'll explain it and you can look at it in detail later. The dark green, and this is Amboseli ecosystem, again, another major area for wildlife and tourism and community conservation. Dark green areas are the protected areas. The lighter green are what are designated as potential conservation conservancies. But they also will be left open. Are where the community would like to congregate all development so that you have commercial centers all in one place instead of being distributed everywhere. And this community in Amboseli ecosystem, called the Olgulului Olorashi Group Ranch, has done an amazing, commendable job of ensuring the land subdivision in transitioning land from communal land to individual ownership, that there's land left aside for individuals to put out their permanent houses in the marked areas with red, but there's also opportunity for each person to get land for rangeland, which is the lighter green, where they graze their livestock and keep and allow wildlife, and no permanent dwellings will be allowed there. And then each person also gets a piece of land in an agricultural area because there are swamps that are prime for agriculture. And then finally, everyone gets a virtual title in a conservancy. So it means for every landowner, you have 4 titles to enable you to have a livelihood and support your family, but to also participate in conservation. It's been a very innovative idea. But here is the challenge. That idea is not reflected anywhere in our land laws. So even though this is their desire in ensuring there continues to be continuity and open rangelands, our national laws do not recognize that provision. So part of what we are doing then is bridging that gap, enabling the government and the land ministry to appreciate these local level planning frameworks and scale up and reflect them in national laws and policies. Next. And so there's been a lot of, in some areas, participatory mapping to define which are the critical wildlife corridors, and some communities are even going on the ground and marking the area as such. Next. Next. And so as I come to one back. So as I come to a close, what we have identified as the critical components for effective connectivity is, one, we need connectivity of data and information. Sometimes there's too many dissipated efforts, too much scattered information, and so we're not singing from the same song sheet. So part of all the actors who are working with connectivity in Kenya to bring all the relevant, most current information together. 2, we need collaboration of actors, the scientists, researchers, planners, private sector who are investing in some of the development so they appreciate why the development needs to be conservation aware, and also policymakers. Thirdly, that communities must be at the center and effectively engaged. This is their land, this is their future, their aspirations must also be contained in the discussions around connectivity, so they're not disenfranchised in conservation proceeding at the expense of local livelihoods. Fourthly, we need coherent policies, both at the ground level at counties, at the country level, and at the ecosystem level. And finally, a cohesive and effective governance that reflects those cohesive policies. And so my final slide, which is a very great punchline for us, is just this year in August, the government then commissioned the development of a new conservation policy because of these arguments that we have been presenting to them over the last few months. And that conservation policy is going to be headed from the head of public service, reporting directly to the president, to ensure we have an ecosystem-based, integrated conservation policy that ensures lands that need to remain as conservation are so recorded, and connectivity instruments, which we have to be innovative and figure out what that will look like, are then developed to ensure. By the head of public service was that we need to embrace collaboration, science-driven solutions, which was exciting to hear from the highest office of the land, and a community-centric approach as we pave the way for resilient ecosystems and empowered communities. Thank you very much. I think that's, you can check Deborah, yes.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Lucy, thank you so much. So Lucy will stay on, and when we get to questions, hopefully she can jump in. So I'm going to shift to Phil Huffman. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hands off. Thanks, Deb. Bonjour, good morning, everyone. My name is Phil Huffman. I'm with a small NGO, binational US-Canadian NGO called the Quebec-Labrador Foundation that I'll say more about in a moment, but I'm here today really on behalf of the Staying Connected Initiative, which is a binational partnership working in northeastern North America to advance cross-border landscape scale connectivity. And I've had an opportunity to be involved in this for the last 15 years or so, and really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation this morning and part of this amazing gathering of people that we're all a part of. I want to say before I start, and for those of you who know American baseball stadiums, I feel like we're in Fenway Park, where we have these poles, these posts obstructing the view, and so I'm sorry that I don't have direct eye contact all the time with everyone. Feel free to move around if you want, or you could just listen at any rate. So we're going to basically shift gears from the global context that Deb laid out and the context that Lucy provided from the other side of the world over in Kenya to this region here in northeastern North America. And I'll sort of paint a broad stroke, big picture about some work that's been happening here over the last really more than 15 years at a binational scale. And then my colleague and good friend, partner Catherine Montacone will zero in to Quebec and dive deeper into what's happening here. So just by way of further introduction, as I mentioned, I work for this NGO, the Quebec-Labrador Foundation. We're an operating NGO, not a philanthropic foundation. We've been working in Eastern Canada and New England for more than 60 years and then increasingly over the last 4 decades or so with colleagues around the world to try to surface and elevate innovative approaches to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage at a variety of different scales, from community-based to regional, transborder, and to global scales as well. And here's just a brief slide that shows a little bit of the footprint of that. The countries in green are among the ones, I don't think this is entirely current, but of where we've been working in the past through some of our programs, both close to home and further afield, and again at the variety of different scales that I mentioned. And I'm just actually curious, how many of you have known of QLF before today? Oh, great. All right. Well, great to connect with you or reconnect with you now. Thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm really here on behalf of this binational partnership focused on connectivity called the Staying Connected Initiative. That's an outgrowth of an earlier effort that really continues in some ways to this day, known as Two Countries, One Forest. It actually should be, I think, some of us have been reflecting, it's really many countries, one forest, because of all of the traditional indigenous territories that lie within this footprint. The core focus for staying connected geographically is in what in Western science terms is known as the Northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion, which is what's shown in sort of outlined in gray on the map there, but it's part of this broader connected region of northeastern North America, encompassing Eastern Canada, New England, and in New York, and then extending further south and west as well. We focus on trying to conserve, restore, and enhance ecological connectivity, and it's sort of terrestrial focus initially, and for sustaining connectivity for wide-ranging mammals, but it's really evolving into a much broader, more holistic, inclusive focus on connectivity broadly, and as Deb touched on, terrestrial, aquatic, and extending out to coastal areas and estuarine areas as well. We work at multiple scales. You can see the URL for the Staying Connected initiative down at the bottom of the slide on the left. I'd encourage you to take a look at the website for a whole lot more information than I'll have time to go through today. And I also just want to mention, we speak a lot about transborder or cross-border, and that's certainly in terms of socio-political or geographic borders, but I want to emphasize it's also about cross-border in terms of institutional borders, cultural borders, sectoral borders, all of that. I think Lucy touched on some of those themes, and it certainly was there for Deb's remarks earlier as well, but really important to think about cross-border in a whole lot of different senses, and transboundary. Okay, just to set the context a little bit, this is a 2-slide sequence that the Nature Conservancy put together that I think is really powerful. We are here in the, sort of loosely in the area that's highlighted in red on the left side of the map. And this is the pre-colonial approximate extent of temperate mixed forest across the globe. So think back 400 or 500 years, something like that, widespread at these latitudes, north and south. And this is a slide of what's left. So again, you can see that's what it used to look like, and this is what's left. And what I think this map illustrates a lot, but for the purposes of my talk, I just want to highlight that this region that we're in right now, right here, is part of arguably the last great stronghold, or one of the last couple of great strongholds of this forest type in the entire world, of a largely intact, relatively unfragmented, vast swath of tens of millions of hectares of this forest. And then the other visual I want to show, this looks sort of similar from the one Deb showed from South America before, also from the Nature Conservancy, this conceptual schematic of the movement of mammals, birds, and amphibians, and the shift in their ranges in the face of climate change. And what this one pops out for, this is the eastern half of the US and extending into Canada, is how the Appalachian Mountain chain, which extends from the southeastern U.S. up through this region, is a critical corridor for species to be moving. This is already happening as the climate changes. And this region where we are here in the northern part of the Appalachians and northeastern North America more broadly is a critical, both a destination for species as they move north, but also a gateway to areas further north as things change going forward. And to enable that, to allow that movement to happen, it's critical to have ecological connectivity at a whole variety of scales, from the very small scale to this very big subcontinental scale. The Staying Connected initiative, as I mentioned, has been around for about 15 years. It's what I think is really an unusual and innovative approach to sustaining and restoring connectivity. Part of what distinguishes Staying Connected is the use of this integrated, or we talk about a multi-pronged approach to connectivity, recognizing that there's no one strategy, no one tool, no one approach that's going to be sufficient to sustain and enhance connections on the landscape. And so Staying Connected, this slide illustrates some of those strategies. This is not comprehensive, but the partnership's work all begins with conservation science, both geospatial analysis through GIS, but also field science, field research, trying to really identify where the most important places are on the landscape to focus conservation and restoration action, and then deploying a lot of different strategies to figure out how to conserve and enhance that. And so it includes tried and true tools in the conservation toolbox of land protection and land stewardship for sure, but also involves land use planning, and I meant to say earlier, actually, one of the distinguishing features of this region is that it's largely privately owned, both in the US and Canada. It varies a little bit depending upon where you are, but there's think like 70 to 80% private land ownership in this region in broad terms. So critical, and control over land use is largely the responsibility of municipalities within that, and obviously private landowners have a hugely important role to play in the health and vitality of the landscape. So land use planning is critical, engagement with communities and with landowners, fostering a sort of thoughtful approach to where development should happen and where important places are for connectivity and for habitat needs and whatnot. This also ties into co-benefits for communities, for human communities, as we see the impacts of climate change with increased floods and whatnot. The more that we can be maintaining an intact forested landscape, the more resilient our communities will be from those sorts of things. Also involves working on wildlife road crossings. So as is happening in various other places, Lucy was talking about out in Africa as well, it's happening in many other parts of the world. Same here, trying to think, are there ways that we can make our roads less of a barrier for wildlife, make them more permeable, and in doing that, make them safer for wildlife, but also make them safer for motorists so that there's less risk of wildlife vehicle collisions and the damage and the injuries and sometimes death for humans that can result from that. So again, this multi-pronged strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, and I don't have a great slide to illustrate it, but multiple scales is another of the defining aspects of the Staying Connected partnership, working from the individual parcel scale and individual community scale to some of these habitat linkages that were shown in those green arrows on the map that I showed earlier, and on up to this big binational regional scale that is part of even a broader continental, subcontinental scale. There's no one organization, no one entity that can achieve all of that on its own, really at any of those scales, let alone when you put them all together. And so SCI is this big partnership of governmental organizations at the provincial, state, and federal level, NGOs, community organizations, academic institutions, a really wide range of different players. And this slide gives you a little bit of a flavor for that. It's only a partial reflection of the breadth of the SCI partnership. And the idea of the partnership is to try to really bind all that together, the partners and the work at multiple scales, multiple places, multiple strategies, in as well coordinated and cohesive a way as possible. And it's really, if you think about collective action, which is something that's talked about in a lot of different fields, this is an example of a partnership trying to optimize its collective action towards a shared vision of a connected landscape across borders. I'll just touch very briefly on something that we could spend the next hour on, but one of the roles of the partnership is to convene, bring people together, as this amazing gathering that we're a part of is doing as well. So we hosted CLLC and my organization, the Quebec Labrador Foundation, co-hosted the first ever summit on landscape connectivity for all of northeastern North America in June in Montreal. And it was an incredibly powerful gathering of about 175 leaders and frontline conservation practitioners, very strong Indigenous, particularly First Nations presence in that, which is part of a building dimension of the partnership that we have a lot of work to do on. But brought people together, and I think was something of a pivot point for really elevating this work across the region in a sort of a new and more sort of amped up kind of way. Again, there's lots more that I could say there. There are a bunch of people who are here, not just the three of us, but who were a part of that. So I'd encourage you to seek us out. We can point you to others who could speak to that. And then just one or two last things to wrap up on. Wanted to highlight that this is an issue, connectivity is an issue that the Staying Connected Partnership has elevated with the top level leaders in the region. So the governors of the of the New England states and also the premiers of the 5 easternmost Canadian provinces. We were able to get them to adopt a resolution on connectivity. It's the one on the left, Resolution 40-3 in 2016, It's, I don't know, 3 pages or so of a lot of real substance about the importance of ecological connectivity and the importance of working within jurisdictions and across and between jurisdictions to advance connectivity. Pretty visionary document, and it was adopted by the governors and premiers that were in office at that time. This is now 8 years later, they've all changed, and part of the motivation of the summit was to re-elevate this issue with the current generation of leaders. And somewhat to our surprise, we were able to get them actually to help to spark them to adopt a new resolution a month ago at their annual meeting in Boston, reaffirming their commitment of their predecessors to ecological connectivity through the earlier resolution. So if you're interested in more on that, come find me, or you can just look online. If you Google NEGECP, that's the New England Governors and Eastern Canadian Premiers acronym, you can find those resolutions. And I think I'll leave it there. Much more to say. I hope that whets your appetite. I'd welcome a chance to talk with any of you more, and Deb and Kateri are other experts on this, along with others who are here today. Again, go to the website. My contact information is there. And then I also want to highlight, Staying Connected has a regional coordinator. His name is Michael Seaton. His contact information is at the bottom. He's officially an employee of the Nature Conservancy, which is sort of the umbrella fiscal and administrative home of Staying Connected, but he works on behalf of the partnership. He's a fantastic person and great resource for all of this. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Bonjour. Kateri Monticone. I've been working on ecological connectivity projects for the past 15 years when I was working for Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'm also a member of Staying Connected Initiative and a member of the Connectivity Specialist Group of IUCN. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici pour vous parler un peu de l'initiative québécoise Corridor écologique. Malheureusement, le reste de la présentation va se passer en anglais. Donc, I'm really happy to be here to talk to you a little bit more about the Quebec Ecological Corridor Initiative that started in 2017. And I really love this picture, which shows a variety of representatives from government, municipalities, forestry, agriculture, research, and I could go on because the Quebec Ecological Corridor Initiative is really based on relationship. It's all about connecting people to accelerate conservation in south of Quebec by focusing on behavior change, empowerment, and engagement to ensure long-term impact of our action. So we first started the initiative by looking at the available science data to prioritize where to work. Those data were coming from, most of it, from 2 Country 1 Forest. And the large arrow that you see is our cross-border vision, which is coherent with the Staying Connected initiative presented by Phil. The Quebec Ecological Corridor Initiative is coordinated by Nature Conservancy of Canada and implemented with the help of 9 other ENGO in 11 regions. So each of the ENGO is allocated to key connectivity zone and is responsible to engage local partners and stakeholders. Nature Conservancy of Canada is responsible to support and coordinate the ENGO and also to engage provincial stakeholders and partners to help us reach this vision. In a short time, we reached some great results, and there's 3 key factors that is mainly responsible for this success. The first one is this ecosystem governance based on the shared leadership. The governance encouraged collaboration between local, provincial, and national stakeholders and partners, and it ensured that we share the same co-created provincial vision and actions with solutions adapted to the local realities. The second key factor is this learning community with the main ENGO to make sure that together we go further. And there's also this peer-to-peer engagement, which really help us get the commitment from the key partners. And the last factor is this government relation work group that help us have this political watch, make sure that we are aware of political opportunities and that we have the link with the different ministry to ensure that what's going on the field is coherent with what's going on at the provincial and the federal level. It's really a kind of a bottom-up and top-down approach. 2 years ago, I think, the Canada launched its ecological corridor program. We were really happy to see that their priorities are the same as the Quebec Ecological Corridor priorities. And we really work to maintain the synergy with those two initiatives. In less than 6 years, we really felt a movement regarding connectivity in Quebec. We have various partners from different sectors that are proud to be an ambassador of the initiative. The Quebec government is a key partner. He is financing a part of this initiative since 2017. In Quebec, we have new guidelines for land use planning that recommend to regional counties to identify their ecological corridors and to make sure to get the help, if needed, from the Quebec Ecological Corridor specialist. In the last spring, we had the climate change experts that specifically recommend to the Quebec government to implement an ecological connectivity strategy and building on the Quebec Ecological Corridor initiative. We also have this great agreement with the Groupement Forestier Québec, which help us reach out to over 43,000 woodland owners. And most of the woodland owners are located on a critical connectivity zone. So we propose management to help maintain connectivity. And now for an example of what we're doing at the connectivity zone scale. Well, last year we started this great collaboration with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation to see how we can implement the IUCN guidelines into our key connectivity zone. So this is the example of Plaisance-Tremblant. Here we try to connect two national parks. So at the bottom of the map, you can see the small Plaisance National Park in green. And then at the top right, you can see the larger Tremblant National Park. And if we look at this map, it can look easy to maintain connectivity. There's a lot of forests. It seems, it's going to be easy, let's do it. But when we look a little bit deeper, here you can see in orange the public lands, in green the private lands. And if you look closely, you can see a small gray line, fine line, that that delimits the properties. So you can see that there's a lot of different owners regarding those properties with different interests. And also, there's 4 regional counties that are concerned by this connectivity zone. A lot of municipalities, like I mentioned, hundreds or maybe 1,000 different landowners. There's also a highway that is creating a barrier. At the bottom of the map, you can see the Highway 50 that is creating a barrier for species movements. And if we add the land use, here you can see in yellow the agriculture, in blue the recreational, in gray the urban development, in purple the urban development that is already planned. So it is complex. And of course, this connectivity zone is also covering the Kitigan-Zibi and Anishinabeg First Nation territory. So we do need to involve and include all those stakeholders and make sure that they become proud of being part of this connectivity zone. And that's what we're doing for the past years. We're listening, we're building trust. We take into account scientific knowledge, but also traditional knowledge and local knowledge. And we look at how stakeholders and partners want to be involved in this initiative. And recently, with the help of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation and the idea of implementing the IUCN guidelines, we made some workshop to make sure that together we agree of the delimitation of the connectivity zone. We agree on the main objective of these corridors. And then there's another workshop coming to talk about the governance. How is it what it should be like, and to see what kind of activity can be maintained in this connectivity zone. And then after, we're going to look at all the properties and make sure that we have multiple solutions to apply to those properties depending on the interest of each of the landowners. So it's going to be more protected area, OECM, long-term agreements, recognition regarding management, new regulation. That's up to, we're going to see. And finally, once the social acceptation is there and people are proud of being in this connectivity zone, well, we hope we're going to have this recognition from the federal and the provincial as a key connectivity zone officially designed. So this is to come, but it's all the time I had to talk about the Quebec Ecological Corridor Initiative, but you can be part of the movement. Just look at us on the media social, visit the site ecologicalconnectivity.com. You can see tools, pictures, image, and learn more about different connectivity projects. Thank you.
Okay. This is on, you said? Okay. You guys can hear me. So I feel like we just talked to you guys for a whole hour. Well, we did talk to you for a whole hour. So I think I do have some prepared questions, but I'd rather actually hear from you all. Lucy, I'm just confirming you're still there.
Yes, I am, Debbie.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, be ready. Yes, could we shift to Lucy on the screen? That will happen. Okay, so does anyone have any questions? I mean, we're a small group. I'd love to just open this up for questions. And Hadley, you have one right away. Or Haley, I keep saying, yeah. Do you all, Haley, oh my goodness, sorry, you guys. Do you want us to use the microphone for people in the audience? And there's, Lucy should be able to hear if you speak through the microphone. Yep.
Sure if it's working.
Yay, there she is.
Hi, Lucy. It's Healy. Hi.
Hey.
I'm sorry you're not here in person. So thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. And one of the things that I was most struck by is your extraordinary success in reaching high-level government agencies and being able to convince them of both the ecological and economic and the social values of the conservation and connectivity efforts that you and your partners have been leading. I think that kind of access to high-level government officials, and we also heard from Phil, I think, you know, the challenges with turnover in those government agencies and how that education of government leaders is an ongoing effort. So I guess I'm so impressed by it, and I wonder, you know, what are the lessons that you can share with us about, like, how do you get that access? How do you maintain that level of education and awareness in government leaders? And I suppose this is a question for both Lucy and Phil. And I'm sorry you're not here in person, but Society for Conservation GIS sends you a big hug.
Thank you. Thank you. Deb, do you want me to respond now, or are you?
Please jump in. That'd be great.
So thank you, Healy, and so sad I can't see you, but glad to hear your voice. You're right. When we got the presidential directive, we were pinching ourselves because we could not believe it's happening. It's like, really? Like, we have a window to do this? How on earth? So the three things I would say were critical to getting us where we did. One, we had a champion in the permanent secretary. That's the technical person in charge of wildlife and conservation, and they're more accessible. And she's been a great champion, and she organized for that appointment with the head of state. But secondly, we also rode on an agenda, we sort of piggybacked on a different agenda. There was a big interest in promoting tourism in the country. And so we were initially going to talk about these community conservation areas as areas that must be considered as prime tourism opportunities, but to then use that opportunity to say, we need to support these community initiatives if we're really going to really benefit from them from our tourism perspective. So we piggybacked on a sort of initial economic agenda, and that then got us, you know, the attention to talk about the tourism. I talked about land planning and connectivity and rights, land rights for communities and benefit sharing, and working groups were formed out of all that. But thirdly, I would say the greatest evidence was what communities are doing on the ground and how they cannot succeed if government doesn't step in. So those examples of what communities were doing voluntarily were really a game changer for the head of states. And so really, it puts the government at a point where they must step up if communities are already doing such great planning at the ground level. So those are the three I would say. Thank you.
Is this, okay, good. Thanks for the question. It's a great one. And I think, Lucy, really interesting to hear your answer. And forgive us if you see us looking down here. I realize it's not that we're looking at the floor or at this post. There's a screen here in front of us that we're able to see. So I'm looking at Lucy, even though it doesn't appear that way from out there, I think. Anyway, Lucy, your response resonates very strongly with what I would say as well, that having one or more key champions in leadership positions, I think, is critical. And so for the resolutions that I referred to that have been adopted by the governors and premiers here in this region, back in 2016, there was the secretary of the Vermont State Agency of Natural Resources was a champion, and the Vermont government has been a leader in connectivity work. And so we were able to work with her and her team and up to the governor of Vermont at the time, and in concert with the same thing happening in Quebec, where Quebec has been a leader on a lot of these things for a long time now. And the agency leadership was able to help to elevate the issue with the premier of Quebec. And so it was really a Vermont-Quebec thing that then sparked to this resolution that was adopted by the whole set of governors and premiers from the 11 jurisdictions altogether. Fast forward to this year, and this ties into part 2 of my answer, but it's a different generation of governors and premiers and different agency heads and whatnot, but again, strong leadership from Vermont and Quebec, and support for all of this, sort of carrying forward from their earlier work, but also now, and this ties into what, in a seemingly indirect way with what Lucy was saying of the piggybacking on something else, that connectivity, I think, has come into its own from the global scale, as Deb was highlighting so well and laying out, to the national levels in Canada and the US and down to the subnational. And so there's tying into that and capturing the momentum from that leaders in this region are paying attention to. And so some of the provinces, some of the states are really committed to that. And in this case, the governors and premiers meeting was in Boston. Governor Healy of Massachusetts was the co-chair. She signed an executive order a year ago that was basically committing Massachusetts to the 30 by 30 global commitment, connectivity as a key piece of that. Our understanding is that she and her administration saw adopting a new resolution on connectivity for the region as a great part of a strategy towards 30 by 30, not just for Massachusetts, but for the whole region. So it's like sort of tying those two concepts together.
That's great. I think Doug was next, or you're next, and then Doug. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
I'm not seeing on the other side of the...
So Lucy, there's polls.
Hello.
We're referring to these polls in the middle of the room, which kind of are funky. So that's what we're...
Javier Beltran from I work with the Nature Conservancy in Argentina. And what it struck me is, although the problems are similar in terms of reconnecting habitats, the realities are totally different between what Lucy showed and what you two showed. And what I'd like to hear is a little bit what are the differences in priorities, because it seems that in Africa, in Kenya is more people-oriented, and here is more, let me say it, nature-oriented in one way or other, although it's policy and everything. So what are the goals in terms of you here in X, Y, or Z years, we would like to connect X, Y, or Z, and we would like to have X, Y, or Z policy instrument. And Lucy, what are your goals in terms of what you expect in X, Y, or Z years in terms of reconnecting? It's challenging, but at least having this opportunity to exchange ideas would make life a little bit simpler for countries like Argentina, also where talking to governors or talking to policymakers is not that straightforward, I would say.
Who wants to go first?
Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the goal, well, we have this goal at the provincial and cross-border vision, where it's like we agreed with the main partners that what will be our vision, and it's really to connect regarding nature, make sure that for the Quebec Ecological Corridor specifically is in the context of climate change, make sure that the migration is done and then we can reverse biodiversity and adapt to climate change. Those is the main objective. But then after, at the connectivity zone, the objective can vary. And of course, you need to, the way to engage the people that are living in this connected zone is really to relate to their values and relate to what is important for them. So the fact that we meet with them, we show the map, we take into account traditional knowledge and the local importance for them, well, it connects with the other goals. So we need to make sure that we understand the vision, we have the same language, but maybe we don't talk about connectivity. And we talk about like making sure that the agriculture is a long-term working well, and then there's the benefits from the functional ecosystem services also. So we adapt the language and the goals to the need of the local people. But at the provincial level, it's really regarding climate change context and making sure that we reverse biodiversity.
Thanks. I'll add to that, and I'm really interested to hear what Lucy and maybe Deb also would have to say. I think two thoughts in terms of this region here in northeastern North America, building on what Kateri said. As much as I emphasized in a slide or two of mine about how this is a largely intact, vast expanse of temperate mixed forest, it's very much of a lived-in landscape. It has been for millennia. And it has been certainly since the time of Western colonization here. And there are people, individuals and communities that are embedded and are tied deeply to the landscape. And so it's about weaving that together with the wildlife, the habitat, the nature side of things. But I think also something that is, and that's I would say the Staying Connected partnership has work to do to be clearer about that and to emphasize that more. We've been primarily sort of nature oriented, but I think the work that Kateri and others are doing here in Quebec is a great example of trying to build on that. And I guess I'd also say that another emerging area for the partnership is in linking in with our Indigenous colleagues, brothers and sisters, and it's about really biocultural connectivity across borders of various sorts, and that as our Indigenous friends will always tell us, that humans are part of nature. We're not separate from nature. We are all part of the environment and the world, and so we want to be thinking about a well-connected landscape to support all life, all beings in this region. So that's what we're working towards. I think we need to get better on our messaging and our understanding, and then our messaging and our action related to that. Lucy, do you want to?
Yes, I'll chime in, but really feel what you've said is, I love the words you've used, biocultural connectivity, because in East Africa, the pastoral people are part of this landscape. I think what was the misnomer was for, in the pre-colonial or colonial period, to create parks that were meant to look like parks without people. That's not a reality. And repainting what the reality should be is the job we have today, to help people see that it's not about parks and no people. It's about a landscape that has wildlife and people. And when you have sustainable landscapes, you can then have sustainable livelihoods. And that's why the approach has really been trying to make sure we are bringing people back to the center, to really disabuse the thought of conservation being only about animals and an ideology that they're only beneficial to the Western tourists who come into the country. So I agree with you. It needs a lot more work on messaging and being able to create that interpretation. The local people get it, but our laws didn't get it when they were first created. And sometimes the ordinary observer doesn't get it either. So there's much work to be done to show rebuilding connectivity is really rebuilding the connections that always existed, but have been fragmented as we've adopted a sort of a modern type of development that doesn't appreciate what the Maasai's call land stewardship. It's how they stewarded the land. There wasn't wildlife in them. It was part of how land stewardship was managed. So interesting question, but it's good to see we all have similar answers, but we are all coming at different points in our development to see how to bring that understanding and knowledge. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to the three of you. I don't have anything to add except for to say, yes, those values carry true to what I've seen in working on this issue for over 2 decades. Doug, I think you're next.
Oh, thank you. Doug Human, I'm a director of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance and represent Landcare Australia there. 3 things, if I may. Firstly, on the cultural connectivity piece, that terminology, that and cultural landscapes, 2 terms that are only really just entering the vernacular of the largely non-Indigenous environmental NGOs in Australia, but there's a lot of resonance with that. Secondly, into beg your pardon, Harley's, got that wrong too. Harley's my granddaughter, beg your pardon, Healy's remark on government endorsements. You know, in Australia, we're absolutely plagued by inertia of government and the adversarial nature of government. So probably even my colleagues in the room that are Australian wouldn't know that in 2014 we put out a National Wildlife Corridors Initiative under a Labor government. We've got a Labor government now, but as soon as the Liberal government came in, that sank like a stone. And I'm just interested in how we think about how we, and you talked about it, Deb, about you might have all touched on it, the bottom up and top down approach, how we do things despite government. And really, as I was hearing you all 3 talk about governments, that would be the icing on the cake. But it's not, I don't think, where this connectivity comes from, and you also talked about that with respect to community. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. And the third one was a real simple one, Deb. You talked about the 101 connectivity leadership. Who's your target audience? But that's just a sneaky second question.
Okay, I'm going to tackle this first part. I can tackle both, but first part around governance. I've been working on environmental policy and particularly connectivity conservation, mainly in the United States for since the late 90s. And this conversation it never even happened. Like the idea of connectivity conservation, corridors, landscape conservation was never in the vernacular. It wasn't even something that many of our federal, I'm speaking primarily down to state, and I would say the same for Canada, federal and provincial, we're even thinking of. We have made major strides, and that was what I was trying to emphasize with the global agreements. Those global agreements are translating into country action. I think Kenya is a prime example. Tanzania is a great example. The United States actually has a White House Council of Environmental Quality, Ecological Connectivity guidelines. And of course, we have Parks Canada, who's really stepped in. So Doug, I think we're stepping into that and we're seeing governments step into it. A lot of governments, I think, are saying, how do we do this? And that's, I think, where the science comes from, which I was trying to highlight. Lucy was really highlighting, and obviously all of us, in terms of being able to demonstrate to countries, well, here's some of the science and that identifies these priority areas. I think it's also incumbent upon us, those of us who have been working in this field for a while, to also be able to share the how. It comes from these various land use planning efforts that have been so well articulated today. It comes from funding and continuing to work with our governments on thinking about how they can fund those things. And so I would just say I think we're at a new chapter. I think how do we get governments to really step in? And your question is how do we move forward despite governments? I think we actually have to do both. I think we have to continue to push from our sides as researchers, as conservation leaders, as Indigenous communities, but also then partner with governments who I think are actually getting there. I think they're hungry for this. That's one of the reasons we did develop some of our toolboxes, including this Nature Connect. I have documents up here I can share with you all. But also that's why there's an entity called the High Ambition Coalition, which is 180 countries have signed on to the High Ambition Coalition to meet the 30 by 30 goals, or target 3. part of that with connectivity being part of that. We are one of 20 technical advisors to the High Ambition Coalition. So every country who's a member of that can contact us and say, how do we do connectivity? And we're doing some of that. So I'm hoping, I mean, I think we're in a new chapter, but I think you have to come at it from both angles. I agree.
I have a thought or two to add, but I want to see if Katari or Lucy want to chime in first. Lucy, would you want to offer thoughts from
Go ahead, Phil.
far side of the world? Okay. On the government side of things, I guess, a couple thoughts. One, I think it's trying to sort of grab the moments of opportunity when they exist, when they present themselves within government at whichever scales. So we're in a favorable climate nationally in Canada and the US at the federal levels for this work right now. There's a favorable climate in at least some of the subnational jurisdictions, the provinces and states, and we've been able to propel some good things forward. Things will ebb and flow, the pendulum will swing at some point, and so it's trying to capture the moments, get as far as we can, but also two thoughts beyond that. One is trying to institutionalize things within government as much as possible, and that can be through laws that may transcend individual administrations at whatever level of government that may be more difficult for them to wipe away than just a administrative policy. But it can also be things like very granular. I think about our transportation colleagues working in provincial and state transportation agencies, and where the road corridors are such key aspects of a connected or a fragmented landscape, and there are some very technical, granular things about the standards for the sizing of culverts or bridge underpasses, things like that, that can either enhance or impede connectivity, and that can get woven in. If we can get the right things woven into the technical standards, that's not the kind of thing that is likely to be subject to a lot of political wins, but shifts, changes. So that's one thought in terms of institutionalizing. And then the other I would say is ultimately there's so much of this work that has to happen outside of government. Government can help to enable it and empower and accelerate it, but ultimately it's all kinds of other things. And it's about the relationships, it's about landowners, it's about communities, it's about collaboration, land use planning and whatnot that gets far beyond the governmental sphere, I guess I would say. Do you guys want to? Lucy, anything you want to add?
And no, Phil, I resonate with what you've said. We are also working, for example, at county level to have them publish county conservancies bill, because if we get these things in law, then they supersede not only people changing over, but in most of our countries, a new political regime comes and you have to introduce yourself again and say why you were trying to do what you were doing. So we're finding that it is true, conservation happens in spite of government, or despite lack of engagement of policy and laws from government, but that can't keep us going forever. It's important to really work on both sides, as Deb has said. And it's hard, but it means that role of keeping relationships, most of us scientists are not very good at that, but it does need keeping that engagement with the political class consistently. Thank you.
I won't repeat what's already been done because I agree with all of you. Maybe one thing that is hard that I see that is hard in Canada and Quebec is something more tangible to measure regarding connectivity, because they all agree on, for example, the target 3, like reach the 30%, and they kind of, in general, people like kind of forget even the other targets. They're like, well, we want to reach the 30%. But how can we really engage and make sure that connectivity is there if it's not this number, you need to measure, because that's what they like. They like to see the 30% reach. And we want to make sure that, it's 30% well connected and protected, but well connected and representative. Yeah, okay. But, it's not part of this 30%. We want to think about the 100% of the territory and make sure that it's functional. So there's where the connectivity is really important. But this kind of twist is kind of missing, like a tangible, it's kind of, they always want a tangible target and result.
Katri brings up a really good point. I'm just going to, and then Alana, I would love for you to jump in. The science for connectivity conservation is very far behind. And I will say that, I mean, that's part of the work we're doing with NCC right now, is to really step into that, particularly around those ecological connectivity guidelines. But monitoring connectivity is a huge, big, messy thing, and we are, and we're in the process of trying to. We work with the UN on that, actually, the World Commission on, I'm going to get it, Monitoring Center, to try to actually create a standard for monitoring connectivity. So that is underway, but we are far behind. This is a new practice, and so I feel like we're in this stage of really creating this as we go along. And Alana, you had it. Okay, we have 2 questions, and then I think we will have to wrap it up. We have a coffee break, so we can go over a little bit, but yes.
Thank you. So my question is, many of us would like to more deeply engage with Indigenous communities and to do it in a good way. And I was hoping you guys could share, it sounds like you all have experience with this, if you could share on that topic, because I work for a small foundation called the Trust for Mutual Understanding. We really want to look at what holds people back from this type of engagement. In the philanthropic community in the United States, less than 1% of all philanthropic dollars flow directly to Indigenous communities. So yeah, any if you could share on how to build trust, how to deepen engagement, get over barriers, because most of us do come from non-native led organizations, and we are non-native ourselves, and that in itself can be a barrier. Thank you.
Jim, I'm sure you've got this, but she needs to come to the next session.
Yeah, you need to come to the next session for sure. I know that there is one, and it's, yes, I think Doug may have something to share on that. Lucy, do you want to tackle that quickly? And then I mean, we all could probably address it, but Lucy, that'd be great if you want to.
Great, thank you, Deb. And thank you for that question. 2 things come to mind. One, looking at the funding flows, and it's something we've studied in some work we're doing called decolonizing conservation, that the metrics used for funding are sometimes out of reach for local communities to respond to. So whereas they have the right ownership, they have the right interest, they would be very keen on implementing the project, the entry levels into these grants are too onerous and too complex for some of the Indigenous communities. So that, I think, is a message we need to keep putting back to funders to come up with frameworks that are more amenable to local groups participating. But having said that, I think one of the ways that we have found successful is to have totally transparent relationships with the local Indigenous communities, where if we're going into an area and we're interested in supporting maybe some connectivity, if the land is theirs, like in the case of Kenya, wildlife belongs to the state, but the land belongs to individuals. So if we go in and all we care about is the wildlife, which is on their land, even though they don't own the wildlife, then you don't get much buy-in, because they'll feel you're here to achieve your goals with your funding to report to your donors. But if you really care about conservation on the land, then it's best to look at that land in totality. Who else is on the land? What are their aspirations of what they want from the land? And how can their aspirations be married with the interests of conservation? So, and transparency is not a thing you go and say, hey, I'm transparent, we need to work together. It takes time. They've got to work with you. So the model in ACC, what we have done over the years, is we started by implementing conservation projects in sites. And then after a couple of years, we implemented with the community by giving them some responsibility in the conservation project. So we're not doing it as the NGO. And then eventually we started sub-granting them resources to implement the very things they had identified. And in the last phase of how we're working, we're pushing for a community-led conservation, not community-based conservation, but community-led conservation, where they lead and they define the goals and the targets, and we're coming alongside them and providing whatever support is needed that they may require. And we feel using that pathway that we've used we've ended up with communities that trust us. And in most cases are now, but over time, we've also invested in building their capacity. So you do need to find a local entity that's willing to invest in those communities to bring them up to speed. And right now, one of the groups we've supported has a greater grant portfolio than ACC. And so that for us, that's a mark of success, that they can get funding directly over time. But I think it's a journey, but it's got to be a deliberate journey of moving from doing with them or for them into supporting them to do what gets the goals that we're aiming for. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. We have I think we're going to take one more question. It's way in the back. And Lucy, I think if you just speak loudly and then I can always repeat it.
My name is Oz Schmitz. I'm a professor in the Yale School of the Environment. As somebody who teaches aspiring students to do this work, I was just wondering, as professionals and practitioners, what kinds of skills would our aspirational students need to have to actually be hired by you right away to do some of this effectively?
Okay, Lucy, the question, and actually this is really applicable to Lucy. She has many PhD students and master's students who work for her. So Lucy, the question is, as practitioners in this connectivity conservation practice, what are we looking for in terms of skills and knowledge for students that may be able to work with us in the future? This gentleman is from the Yale School of Forestry and is curious about that. I think all of us can answer it, but Lucy, if you want to take a crack at it, that'd be great.
I don't know if there's any one particular discipline, but definitely ability to communicate and engage, very interpersonal skills with communities, because they're very relational. And I think that matters in getting these connectivity discussions. But two, a good understanding on the science of connectivity, which as Deb said, we are all trying to learn it as we go, but also an understanding of land use, land tenure, land rights, and access. So that the solutions you come up with, because everything happens on land. How do we look at all the intersectoral play on land, be it infrastructure, roads, rails? So not those necessarily having those disciplines, but ability to appreciate how those other sectors impact on land. So I'd say a land-based skill, a great skill of communication with communities, but also a good understanding of the science of how, conservation, biodiversity, and all those elements come together in a land space that's owned by a third party who you want to be in. So it is complex, but I found the land piece has been the missing piece in most of our work before.
Really quickly, if I had something to say, I would say the skill to adapt to the different situation, adapt to the different public target, adapt the vocabulary that you're saying, adapt to a different situation or challenges, and don't think that you can wear all the shoes, but make sure that you can help the people that have the expertise to drive in and to go to the same vision and be able to engage different stakeholders. So yeah, adaptation.
I'd echo what my colleagues have said. I guess I would add that I think we need certainly expertise in individual disciplines that are under this very broad mosaic of things that relate to connectivity. But we also need the cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary understanding and ability to work across different disciplines. And I think the other thing I would say is a lot of it is around the soft skills. So of collaboration and dialogue and intentional, respectful listening. Some of those things that are, because fundamentally, and Catherine emphasized it with the Quebec Ecological Corridors Initiative, our Indigenous friends and colleagues that remind us all the time, this is all about relationships. It's human relationships, it's the relationship of all beings, and that ultimately it's about how we engage in respectful, ethical, constructive relationships that's going to get us where we need to go.
I'm just going to add, thinking about things at a large scale. I think of connectivity conservation as putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And so being able to take that 20,000 foot view and then move down to the to the more fine scale, the local view. It's a skill that I think some people really, there's just inherent, sometimes people can think that way. I don't think that is actually for everyone. But it's really, I think that is a key skill set. And that is, again, those soft skills. I am going to wrap us up because we're over time. I have these postcards if anyone does want more information around our Nature Connect. I didn't get to Doug's question around Connectivity 101, but I would say it is for anyone who is interested in this topic. And we hope that that reaches multi-jurisdictional people as well as locals, students, hopefully. It's really the first curriculum that is at least online and free for all. I just want to send a huge thank you to Lucy. I'm really sad she wasn't here, but she stepped in and did a fabulous job in a very tough situation. And we all miss her.
Maxie over there.
Yes, it's one of your, I know there's so many friends here that missed you, and I really miss you. So Lucy and I get to do a lot of work together. And Catherine, Phil, thank you. And of course, to ILCN. So thank you, everybody.